All right. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. This is Live with Faye. Every day we bring up one subject of interest, which we believe is of interest to the country, and we discuss it with people who understand it better than we do. The idea is to improve our understanding of the subject matter. Now, before the Supreme Court today, there were appeals made to ask the farmers to be removed from their protest sites on the borders of Delhi on the highway. Now, the argument placed before the court was that while the farmers have the right to protest, they are actually affecting the lives of other people because people of Delhi aren't able to access the borders. There was also an argument that Mr. Salvi put forward that it's stopping the movement of vegetables and other produce into the city, and as a result, prices are going up, and so it's affecting the citizens of Delhi, and so these farmers should be removed. Now, finally, the court did decide, and I'll read out what the court has decided. The court has decided that, and I'm quoting, we are of the view at this stage that farmers' protests should be allowed to continue without impediment, without any breach of peace, either by protesters or the police. But before that, there were some observations made by the Chief Justice. The Chief Justice said, among other things, that one thing we make clear, we recognize the fundamental right to protest against a law, but it cannot affect other fundamental rights and the right to life of others. We recognize the farmers have a right to protest, but we are on the board of protesting. We ask the union government if anything can be done to alter the nature of protest, which will ensure the rights of others are not affected. So this is what I'm doing this evening. We have perhaps the best panel we could possibly put together. So I'm going to be talking very little. We're going to be listening a lot. We have senior advocates of the Supreme Court, Mr. Sidharth Luthra, Mr. Anand and Mr. Kailash Vasdev right now. As citizens, we want to understand what is our right to protest and at what point does it qualify as affecting the rights of others? So is it okay to protest on the road? Should we only be able to protest in a Maidan? What constitutes protest and what doesn't? So that's my first question. As per what Article 19(1)(a) tells us, that we have free speech and expression, which also means that when we are unhappy, we can express our unhappiness. This was a country built on the idea of, of non-violent protest, of civil disobedience. Based on our law today, where does this stand? Mr. Luthra, if I may please start with you. What is the right that the average Indian citizen has to protest in our country?
The Constitution protects the right to free speech and therefore the right to protest. But these rights are subject to reasonable restrictions. Reasonable restrictions are in terms of laws that come in. So you have restrictions in terms of if you block roads, there are restrictions under the Police Act. There are areas where Section 144 CRPC can be imposed, where a gathering of not more than 4 people can be brought in at a time. Initially, if you recall, there used to be protests at the boat club in Delhi, and there was also protests permitted, and these were permitted protests. You went to the Deputy Commissioner of Police, took permission that we are holding a protest, and you would hold a protest whether at the boat club or at near Sansad Marg, on Sansad Marg, Parliament Street. But as time went by, we found a very interesting situation where provisions such as Section 144 were imposed not for a limited period, but were almost permanently imposed. And it became a point where the people's ability to protest was restrained. Now, you have seen in the last few years that people are out, there are candlelight marches, people at India Gate and public places. The question is, the city belongs to all of us. These are public places. We understand that there must be a restriction. You can't impinge, for example, if you block a street and people can't reach hospital, now that's a matter of some concern. People should be able to reach essential requirements, essential services. But at the same time, is it not incumbent on the Indian state to ensure that people have a place, opportunity and a place of visibility where they can vent their frustration with the government? Because if one option is to go to your MPs and MLAs and say, please listen, we know, we'll have to see how much the MPs and MLAs do, but if the MPs and MLAs don't do, and if it's a people's movement, I don't see any reason why we should not be able to change the order of things or seek to change the order of things by non-violent protest. And that's very important. That's my fundamental right. And it can't be curtailed except in limited circumstances.
Mr. Grover, this is a perfect argument, but when we implement it, unfortunately, in our country, it isn't as perfect. Especially over the last 2 years or so, we've seen the establishment or the government or the police treat protesters like it's a foregone conclusion that they're going to turn into a mob. It's a foregone conclusion that they're going to affect people. And then, even in, for example, the Delhi riots case, there was an argument that because Shine Bagh blocked a road, angry people started a riot. Um, are we changing the way we look at protests in this country?
Faye, I want to make 3 points. I think these are very pertinent questions. But let me tell you, I actually happened to be in court, as it were, in the VC, and I heard the proceedings of the first court when Justice Vasdev was presiding over that court, and I have a slightly different take on than you. I think, and this is in the context of the Shaheen Bagh protest, where unusually the Supreme Court, also by a three-judge bench, tried to make a difference between protests in the pre-independence era, colonial times as it calls it, and the post-independence era. No, we have a fundamental right to protest now enshrined in our constitution under Article 19. It didn't exist in the constitutional framework in the colonial times. But unfortunately, the court in that judgment, it's known as the Shaheen Bagh commonly, but Amit Sani's judgment, where the court actually practically says that you don't have a right to protest, which would block roads. Okay, and it's actually, I would say, in polite terms, doesn't allow the protest to actually take place in the form that it should. And I agree with Sidharth, it's absolutely right that the state has limited the right to protest over a period of time, and people just don't have a place to protest. So that is one, I'm not going to address it. But what happened today, in contrast to the Shaheen Bagh case, is very, very instructive. And the Chief Justice made it clear at the outset that we are telling you that the farmers have a right to protest. That's one fundamental difference. I think we should understand the change that has taken place. And I think it's very good that the Chief Justice had made it very clear, because the normal response is to actually say, no, you can't protest because of various reasons. And Mr. Salve began, and he wanted an order to say that the protesters should be removed because they are blocking the roads. And the Chief Justice asked a question, and he said, in fact, he commented on Mr. Salve that you're overpitching your case. The whole of Delhi is not blocked. Entries are not blocked all over. And he asked the question to the Solicitor General whether all entries were blocked. And in that context, he said the protest should be allowed to go. And I think that's a very significant statement by the top court. The second point where I disagree with the first court is where the Chief Justice made a remark saying that we cannot look into whether we should be allowed to go into Delhi. Remember, the farmers wanted to protest in Delhi. Why should they not be allowed to go in? And there's a problem which Sidharth has alluded to. And I think they should be allowed to go in. And there the Chief Justice said that, we can't decide whether the protest would turn violent or not. And that is only for the police to decide whether they should be allowed to go on into Delhi. I think that is also an issue which has to be discussed, because any protest which is not allowed is open to the court to intervene, depending on what basis the decision is taken, etc. And thirdly, the proposition by Mr. Salve was it is the protesters who are blocking the entry into Delhi. And rightly, Mr. Chidambaram said, no, they wanted to come into Delhi if they've been allowed to go. And they said, we can go to Ramlila ground. Why can't they go there? And it is the police who blocked them. Please appreciate that. So there are very significant pointers. Fourthly, and I think again, the Chief Justice was very right in saying, look, this is going to be an intractable problem. Why aren't people talking to each other? And obviously the government is, taking its own time to decide when to meet, and it has to be sorted out. So I think today's order in the context of the discussion which went on, or the arguments, is very significant. It actually doesn't go on the lines of the Shaheen Bagh judgment, which was given, by the way, after the protests were over and it had become totally infructuous. There was no need to give that judgment, but that judgment was given. I think it's important to see the pointer especially with the opening remark to everybody by the Chief Justice. Look here, we are telling you very clearly the farmers have a right to protest and we are not going to move them out. I think that's a very, very important statement in our constitutional democracy and it's a point of departure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vasdev. Bringing this to you, there was also conversation about the purpose of protest and that protest for the sake of protest is not okay. But if there is a purpose, the Supreme Court said that they would like to facilitate that purpose. Would you explain to us again, if as I said, I'm upset with something, do I have to justify my reason for protest? Do I have to have a clear reason for why I'm going out to protest? What does this mean for ordinary citizens?
Evening. You see, the fact is the right to, when does a person protest? When he's unhappy about something. He's dissatisfied. He feels that his rights are being infringed. He's being wronged. Now, the right to protest is a basic right. I agree with Anand and Sidharth totally. It's an essential right to put forward your views that I don't agree with you. Now, in the right to protest, there are two facets. A person has a right to protest. A citizen has a right to say, don't infringe my capacities to move around freely. In the farmers' protest, which has now come in, or the Shine Bagh, which took place in Delhi, the road marches and the road blocks, which take place all over the country once in a while. You see them frequently in Bengal. You won't allow people to move. You won't allow people to transport themselves. You won't allow people to do all sorts of things. Now, those kind of protests is something which are a matter which become a matter of concern. The siege which follows a protest is not constitutionally acceptable. Take, for example, Bombay, and now Mumbai, I'm sorry, my apologies before I'm in trouble. Now, Mumbai has two entry roads. Supposing you block them off for a month, for any purpose whatsoever, it becomes the siege of a city. If it is a siege of a city, it is unacceptable because you're infringing the rights of those who live in that city.
Yes.
If you look at the context of the Indian court system with regard to protests and how they take place, one of the first interesting cases which took place was the concept of Gherao in Bengal. When the communists came into power in 66, 67 in Bengal, the concept of Gherao became very popular for industries. Managers were locked in, they were thrown into custody, they couldn't move out, they were kept in rooms for hours together. The government of Bengal issued notifications that the police would not interfere till such time as they didn't receive clearances from the authorities. It became very cumbersome for the police because under the IPC and the applicable laws, a lot of powers which are given to the police to prevent the disruption of public peace, public order, public law and order. So in 1968, the High Court said that, look, fortunately, I mean, a beautiful judgment which wasn't carried forward, the three-judge bench judgment, which wasn't carried forward because it was, I think, in my view, the right view. That you have a right to protest, the others have a right to say that, look, don't infringe our rights. We have come to a situation today where things are coming to a head in governance and otherwise. That is where the catastrophe is moving in. We're leading to a situation where all controls, all regulations have got to be balanced to the rights of citizens. The protesters say that their farm rights, the rights to produce, the rights to sell, and all are being interjected by statutory provisions. The other citizens say, look, no, this is the right law and this is to be done. That is to be tested in a court. I'm giving you both sides of the picture as one sees it. Today, Supreme Court says you're entitled to protest, but don't infringe on the rights of others to live a free life. That is a balanced view of the whole situation. You may have a right to protest, but can you interdict the rights of anybody else? A gentleman coming from outside on a medical emergency cannot enter the city. Is it fair on him? A person wanting to go out of the city for a personal need, a demise, to see somebody is done. So therefore, you've got to strike a balance between the rights of the protesters and the rights of the citizens.
All right. So let me now put a counter question for the whole panel. I know Mr. Luthra has to leave in a few minutes, so I'll start with you. There's always been this argument: if you approach the police in order to arrange a protest or a meeting, the police will say, "Go to Azad Maidan," or "Go to a Maidan where you're not in anybody's way." Now, protesters will turn around and say that if we go to Azad Maidan, nobody will pay any attention to us because we'll just be sitting there, and as a result of not inconveniencing anybody, we won't actually be creating any impact. Is there a balance there? Or is someone who protests on a road even slowing traffic down, are they inconveniencing other people? Mr. Luthra?
I think the balance is to be arrived by the state creating public places of protest. And I completely agree with you. If you send somebody off to Azad Maidan, or let's say outside the Red Fort, the whole purpose of the protest is going to be lost, because what does the person want? That the authorities listen to their grievances, and these are hopefully genuine concerns that the citizen is raising. So when you shut that out, as I told you, the example when for, in the boat club area, which used to be traditionally a place of protest, they suddenly had a complete restriction for years together by imposing Section 144. People will get permissions. Why can't we go back to the old system where permissions to protest are given for specific numbers and regulated? The difficulty that happens is, and look, this is human nature. So you give a permission for 500 people, and then there's going to be a crowd for 5,000. That's where the balancing act has to take place, because that's where you can have a situation where the mob can be peaceful, or when there is a restriction, the mob can be violent. And there is some amount of practical policing that has to go through in matters like this, where while permissions are granted, there are issues of information and intelligence which do crop up with the investigating agencies as to when a mob is likely to turn violent. And that happens. It's not that doesn't happen. But having said that, can we shut out the citizens' right to protest? I fear not. I mean, I think the fact that we are restricting public places of protest is something which the citizen is not going to stand up for. I've seen this as a young man in the emergency days, how people started walking out in the street. And if you keep containing people, public anger on situations which concern them are not going to get away, not going to go down. Today, the farmers are on the borders of Delhi because they have what they believe are genuine grievances. These are matters which need to be resolved. And I think it's a great move that the court is trying to oversee a kind of resolution. They tried in Shaheen Bagh, not successful. But here there's an interesting change. I understand that this time the court has asked government officials to be part of the committee. So hopefully, or government representatives, so hopefully there will be a representative. As Anand rightly said, the court has said the right to protest is not going to be whittled down. So I hope we will see some kind of a solution to this, because this can't go on. Citizens can't be unhappy, and normalcy, as Mr. Vasdev said, to lives, people accessing medical facilities, family emergencies, must also be restored. That balance is urgent. It's gone on for too long, I fear.
Mr. Grover, the other conversation that, and Mr. Luthra, if you need to leave, I understand. Thank you so much for your time. Mr. Grover, the other conversation that did come up in court was the idea of, and they were called a mob, and then there was a conversation of whether or not they're a mob or just a group of farmers. But in case they turn violent, what happens? And again, this CJI pointed out very clearly that the court cannot weigh in on the nature of the gathering. That is for the police to take decisions on the ground based on what the police assesses on the situation. So if you could explain to us, again, legally, as the law stands, when a group of people have gathered, and we understand also, like Mr. Luthra said, that 500 people becomes 5,000, we understand there are more and more farmers joining this gathering every day. They're coming in now from other parts of the country. Where does that line legally come into the police to assess that, okay, this has become too big for us to manage, we need to move them? What rights or what authority or how much leeway does the police have here based on our law?
Well, the law is one. There's also the political dimension. But let me just explain to you. See, we have to appreciate, all of us, that these kind of protests happen because problems are not being resolved. So I think it's very important, as Sidharth has also mentioned, that the Chief Justice and the First Court has actually said that our purpose here is to try to resolve. If the conflicts are not resolved, then the people actually ventilate their grievances through protest. Now, again, if you don't have public spaces, you are actually creating more anger. Then the question comes for the police and the establishment to actually trust the protesters. Unfortunately, what has happened is every protest is not trusted today. This is the reality. You've come to the situation that, and look at the difference between earlier protests. Let's say, I'm not talking about Shaheen Bagh, because there can be disputes about that. But this protest at least has made it very clear. Not only are we going to be peaceful, very clearly, but also we will not try to interrupt normal processes. They made it very clear when they said they're going to have a Bharat Bandh. They said we will allow essential services to be carried on, etc. So I think there has to be intelligence on the part of the state and the police to say and assess whether indeed, for example, in this case, if they had allowed the demonstration to go into Delhi and allowed them to have a place in Delhi, whether that would have not been a better resolution. And I think there the element of trust and distrust comes in. And unfortunately, I said earlier, one of the reasons why this has happened is it's not the protesters who are saying we want to prevent people entering Delhi or we want to block the roads. Apart from the fact that all entries are not blocked, as it was written in the court today, they have to be able to calculate, that is the state and the police. Let's allow them into Delhi. That will actually help build confidence, and you have to have proper, whenever a situation arises where the protests take actually a massive level, like in the farmers' protest today, you have to be able to assess whether they are going to turn violent or not. The mob is not a correct description. Mob actually means that they are going to be
Violence.
violent. Okay, so I think the problem arises at three levels: mistrust, proper intelligence, and not be able to make a decision that people would be peaceful. You can't label all protests as the state is doing today. I think that's the root of the problem. Why we are seeing apparently the protesters blocking the roads, which they are not according to me. It's the police which is preventing them.
So
And
we have a couple of, yes.
no,
We
you
have a
need
couple of questions from
you need
the
to allow to
audience.
ventilate people's
Yes.
grievances. This is a very important, you have to allow them to vent their feelings.
Yes.
It's a very important part. It's like a psychological thing for people to feel that we have had our voice heard. We've actually made our points clearly, and we have been able to voice our protest. If you stifle people in that, you're going to create another problem. But I partly agree with the Chief Justice that look, the situation on the ground has to be assessed by the authorities there. But I think it's marred by the fact that there is a distrust of all protesters. That's my point.
Absolutely. Well, Mr. Grover, because also let's point out the fact that when these farmers began marching from Punjab with the clear declared aim that they were going to go to Delhi, the Haryana police stopped them at many places. There were water cannons fired at them. There was, they were lathi charges, there were tear gas. Like Vimo has pointed out, the main reason that the authorities would block protesters is to almost instigate them to be violent. Is there an examination post facto of who triggered the violence? If the police were to continuously stop protesters in this fashion and then say they turned violent, because in this case they didn't, but is there a rule book as to
Well,
when the police can use force?
if you scrutinize the order of the first court today, it says very clearly. It doesn't lay the blame on the door of the farmers. It says there should be no violence on the part of the farmers or the police. That's a very important statement. So,
Yeah.
according to me, the situation is not out of control. I think it will be a very good gesture on the part of the state and the government and the central government, because Delhi government is supporting the farmers, and I think the farmers have made it very clear that they are going to be peaceful. Not only that, can you have a better gesture than the langar being shared with the police to indicate that they are not opposed to the police? They are not opposed personally to the police. They're only making their point of view felt, and ultimately there are going to be meetings between the government and the farmers' representations. And if they are allowed to come into Delhi, then you actually build confidence of a relationship between the state and the protesters, and you also solve the problem of entry into Delhi, which is a grievance of the people in Delhi. You need to have a space, public space, where they can house themselves and make their voice heard. That's the important point which Sidharth also made, and the court has been seized of it in the past, but that has been curtailed. That's why the problems are occurring, and unfortunately, the the blame lays on the door of the state, which has been restricting the peaceful protesters in exercising their right under Article 19, the fundamental right, not only free speech, is right to assemble peaceably without arms. That's 19(1)(b). Not only free speech is within 19(1)(a), but to right to assemble also, to make your voice heard. So there are two things, 19(1)(a) and 19(1)(b). Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vasdev. I want to bring up an example from Mumbai. A few years ago, we had farmers walk to Mumbai, and they were again stopped outside of Mumbai, and they were going to come in. The government met them outside of the city along with the police and proposed to these farmers that because there are exams going on, because people have to go to work, the farmers agreed to walk at night. So they actually walked between midnight and 4 a.m. to reach their protest site so that they don't inconvenience anybody. Is it important for government and police to also reach out in this fashion and appeal for solutions rather than to use roadblocks and barbed wire and tear gas?
Look, this farmers' protest has got two distinct factors to it. We are no one to judge who's right and who's wrong, whether the government is right or the farmers are right or all India farmers are right or the Punjab farmers are right. It's becoming a matter of an imbroglio. To my mind, what is very peculiar in this whole protest is the farmers have challenged the validity of these acts in Parliament, in the Supreme Court. Having invoked the jurisdiction of the courts, waiting for the court to decide, you are stifling a city. You are unhappy about the laws which have been passed, but then why do you stifle Delhi? Delhi may be the principal seat of government which has enacted the law, but the citizens are not part of this. The law applies all over the country. If you're going to have a law which is an all India law, the other states are not protesting. It is only Punjab, Haryana farmers who are coming up, and a few farmers here and there are coming forward to say that this law is bad. All right, if it's bad, then you've challenged it in court. If you've challenged it in court, then why the protest? I could understand. No, I could understand if you hadn't gone to court.
Can I beg to differ with Kailash?
I'm instigating you.
Well, can I say something, Faye? You're the
Please. Yes, Mr.
Well, there are 2 points. One is the point about whether once you have launched a challenge, can you protest? I think there I beg to differ with the Kailash. First of all, it's not the farmers who have actually challenged. There are other people, because in our court system, unfortunately, the public interest litigation has become so wide, any Tom, Dick and Harry without any interest can challenge. So perforce farmers have to intervene to see that their interests are not jeopardized. But I think
here the farmers have come.
Not only
in this case, the farmers have. Yes, some of the farmer groups have come.
Some farmers have come because they're prompted. They're prompted because otherwise they would not be heard.
The farmers have come.
Yeah. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Secondly, I don't think there's anything wrong with them simultaneously appealing through peaceful protests, which are permitted under the Constitution, to say to the government that we want these laws changed. These are simultaneous processes. I'll give you an example of the long fight we had on 377. We were simultaneously appealing to the court and also to parliamentarians to change the law. I think that's perfectly permissible under the Constitution and it should be pursued. The third point, which Kailash validly makes, I think, is how to make sure that the citizens of Delhi are not totally inconvenienced. There is bound to be some inconvenience, but it should not be to such extent that their rights are completely denuded. So their as Faye pointed out, there's a good example where the Maharashtra government proactively said, look, this is a problem and let's sort it out. You do your protest and you carry on your protest, and we will see that your protests are actually allowed into Mumbai, etc. Why can't it be done here? These are problems which can be resolved by the government. But if you say to the people, you are not going to be allowed to come to Delhi, then these problems are arising, not because of the protesters, but because of the actions of the police by stopping them and not allowing them to come to Delhi. They have said we are prepared to go to Ram Leela grounds and peacefully protest there. That can be regulated. I don't see a problem. I think this is a problem of the making of the state and the police, which is causing inconvenience, and it is not fair to lay the blame on the door of the farmers.
See,
So,
Anand,
Mr. Vasdev, you know, if we are going to suggest, Mr. Vasdev, if we are going to suggest that everyone who has a problem with a particular law, with an action of the government in this country, approach court, aren't we then just making the court the referee for everything the government does, sort of like a quasi-executive, a parent of the executive? So the government will do something and then we'll just go to court for everything. It is my right to protest if I choose.
It is.
As it is my right to go to.
You have both rights, no dispute. But having it gone to court in the validity of an act. Now, Anand is right that when the Nirbhaya case took place, there were protests and midnight watches from Rajpath down to India Gate. And in addition to that, there were court proceedings, there were parliamentary, people knocked at the doors of parliament to amend the laws. Now, when you did the march from the Rashtrapati Bhavan area down to India Gate, it was not over days together. It was just for 3 or 4 days till the parliament decided to come into the picture and the Supreme Court decided to take cognizance of the offences. Here the court has taken cognizance. The lawmakers, that is parliament, said that, look, we're willing to discuss it with you. Now comes the flip side of it. You are now holding a city to ransom. We who are staying in this city realize what we're going through. People who work here are unable to come to work. Is it fair on them? You blocked off Gurgaon, you have Gurugram, you blocked off the Noida Road, you blocked off the Chandigarh Highway, you blocked off everything. You're holding the city to siege. You have a right to protest. Please protest. But do you have the right to hold us at ransom? Second aspect of it. Whenever you have a right to protest, you're entitled to do so. Delhi has places where you can do it. You are allowed to protest at the Ram Leela grounds. You are allowed to protest at Janpath. Those are open places. But with such large numbers, you cannot accommodate them in the city. If the intent is to make a point, you made a point by going to court. I'm very firm on that. If you've gone to court, you have foregone your right to do anything else. The moment you have both running together, you are trying to put pressure on government and the court to take a decision, which I think is unfortunate.
How are you putting pressure on the court? By demonstrating your
demonstration? You're telling the court we will demonstrate if you don't decide?
No, but they were not saying that. They are not saying that by demonstrating we are putting pressure on the court.
No,
the slogans are only on.
I'm not a question of what they're saying. I'm not a question of what they're saying. The impact of it is we are going to stay on this position till you don't decide.
No, they are not saying that. They are saying, I think you have one.
You may not say it, but by conduct you're communicating this.
Kailash, you have one point which I think is important. I think I disagree with you on this issue, that it's not the protesters, but the police which is preventing them from coming to Delhi, which has resulted in the entry points being blocked, which is inconveniencing the Delhi residents. Okay, that's one point. But if they had allowed them, the issue is whether large numbers can be accommodated. Now, this has to be assessed on the ground. Have they even bothered to think about that? No. Because let me tell you that if they had allowed them, the large numbers would not have come.
Let me remind you. In the earlier part of this century, Mr. Tikait, who was the leader of the farmers, led a huge protest which came up to India Gate.
Everybody knows that.
You remember that? People died over there.
Yeah, but that is different. From
Hold. I'm not speaking whether Tikait was right or whether the government was wrong or what. I know this much, that for us to travel across the city became impossible. Impossible.
So
therefore, to permit this kind of a protest where all of us are inconvenienced is something I don't agree with.
okay, fair enough. Also, I think one of the things as a responsible citizen is also to not only feel the emotions and anger of the farmers, and they're not restricted only to Punjab or Haryana, but also to understand their point of view and to dialogue with them. I don't think citizen in Delhi can just say, I'm only bothered about going to my work. I'm not bothered
That's
about
his right.
how my no, 1 minute, Kailash. I think as a responsible citizens, you cannot ignore. We in Delhi cannot ignore what are the issues that are involved. We have to participate in that as a responsible citizen. You can't say my job is only to go from home to office and that's it.
No.
In that case, you don't have a right to say whether they're right or wrong. In that case, you abdicate your responsibility as a citizen. They are the persons who produce our food, and they actually allow the food to come onto the table in our homes. And we have a responsibility to put pressure on the government to do what? Which is exactly what the court is doing. For heaven's sake, have a dialogue, which is not
They're having a
happening.
dialogue.
No,
They're
this is not
having a
happening.
dialogue.
Every 1 week
No,
later, you are having a dialogue.
does it say anywhere in our constitution, and all of our fundamental rights are with certain reasonable conditions?
That's right.
Restrictions, yeah.
Does it say that if you have a protest, can't simultaneously protest at the same time?
No, it
Sorry,
doesn't.
I didn't hear you, Faye.
Mr. Vasdev?
I didn't hear you, Faye.
No, does it be
You're cracking
anywhere
up.
in our constitution that if we have approached the courts for justice,
No,
that we
no,
cannot
not at all.
No, there's no
protest
such
also at the
restriction.
same
There is no such restriction. The answer which I have is very simple. If you're approaching a court, then let the court decide. You can't hold these kind of protests for the purposes of what you're trying to say.
No, I'll tell you, I'll give you an
You
answer
invoke
to
the
that.
jurisdiction of the court.
See, I'll give you an answer to that, and I think there's a normative framework which Pratap Bhanu Mehta actually expounded in his last lecture at the NLU Delhi. Suppose I went to court, I lost. Can I protest then? You would be considered. No, exactly.
My answer is no.
No, I'll tell you. You may be
Bhanu
right.
Mehta says you can. I disagree.
No, you may be right. I assume you're right. In that case, I should fire with both the guns. I should be allowed to fire with both the bullets, both at the court as well as in parliament. Therefore,
Why did you go to court?
You cannot force me to follow one path, and at the end of it, you say you can't do it. You see my point?
No. If you go to court and you invite a judgment.
No. I will try to persuade parliament as well as go to court.
You may do what you want. But if you've gone to court, you see what will happen then, Anand, from what you're saying is this: anybody who goes to court and loses will say all sorts of things.
No, I'm on the point of, and I assume for the moment, for the sake of argument, that if I go to court, lose, I won't be able to protest. Let's say that is a social contract, which
That's the correct norm.
No. So now let's assume that to be correct, which is disputed by authors and other people. I'm assuming that to be correct. In that case, I cannot be asked to forgo my
they have their own view. Everything is so diverse.
I can't be asked to forgo my recourse to parliament. I must be able to.
Please go. Who's stopping you? But don't stop everybody else. You take your recourse.
That's a different question. That is at the hands of the police, who can manage but are refusing to do so because of political.
All right, gentlemen, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm glad we are disagreed. Otherwise, we would be patting ourselves on the back. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a very spirited conversation, but obviously, as citizens, we have to understand the nuance of the law better. We're going to take a break now, but to our audience, I want you to stay with us. We'll come back at 9 o'clock. We're having a conversation. This is going to be very interesting with Mr. Arvind Subramaniam, who's the former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, and Sumitra Chatterjee, Assistant Professor of Economics at Penn State. We're going to talk about India's Atmanirbhar plan, whether that's actually something India should be doing. Is it ill-advised? And is this something that's going to hurt our economy further? That's at 9 o'clock. So don't go anywhere. Mr. Grover, Mr. Vasdev, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.